do that, right? First of all, it just seems odd to us, odd to a lot of people, how such an ancient story can be meaningful to us today. In fact, I do a lot of work online, and on occasion, I'll get just this whole barrage of typically atheists who will come onto my page, and they'll leave comments such as, "What does a Bronze Age goat herder have to teach us today?" It's, words such as that. Not only is this chronological snobbery, as if ancient peoples have nothing to communicate to us today, it also betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of humanity. It's the understanding that we ourselves have, as it were, evolved intellectually and morally in all sorts of ways in such a way that those who lived ages ago have nothing to teach us, all the while betraying the fact that we stand on the shoulders of giants. Every generation builds upon that which a generation before has discovered, has taught, has whatever contributions they have made to humanity's knowledge. So we're all standing on the shoulders of these giants. But when it comes to the Bible in particular, what those who don't understand what we're doing here, what they don't get is the fact that when we're reading in Genesis, for instance, which we will be in today, or the Gospels, as far as that goes, what we're reading about are people that are, yes, different than us in surface ways, but exactly the same as we are when it comes to our fundamental proclivities and temptations and struggles. Not just with regard to ourselves, but with regard also to our family, such as our brother or our sister or our wife or our parents or whoever it is. So the marriage struggles, for instance, that I've had and that you have. I mean, maybe there's some exceptions out there, a few of you who have never had any marriage struggles. That means you're single. But the marriage struggles that we all face, that's what people like Jacob faced. The often antagonism that happens between brothers. Well, you can read about that over and over, or at the beginning in Genesis chapter 4, right? With Cain and Abel. And it continues with Isaac and Ishmael, and it continues with Jacob and Esau. It continues all through the scriptures. These things are not new. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book on Jacob. Because, yes, on the surface, he seems very different than we are. But all you have to do is just scratch the surface a little bit. And it turns out the guy's the same as we are. He's dealing with things like selfish ambition. And he's dealing with parents who show favoritism. And he's dealing with deception, his own deception of others and others' deception of him. And then he's dealing with, and then we've all experienced this, a boss who's also his uncle and father-in-law. I hope none of you have experienced that. It was a joke. It took a minute. It's early in the morning. You've only had one cup of coffee. But we have all dealt with troublesome bosses, right? Or maybe an uncle, or maybe it was a father-in-law, whoever it is, that is a challenge at times. Jacob dealt with that. And some of us have dealt with loss and grief too. Some of you are dealing with it right now. I'm still dealing with it right now. Jacob dealt with his own grief, and his was very unique because Jacob's grief was over the loss of a child that for years and years and years he assumed was dead. And then he had this moment of epiphany when he realized this child that all these years he thought was dead and gone was not only alive, but prospering. Jacob dealt with grief. He dealt with aging. He dealt with all the same things that, I don't care what age you are, I don't care if you're married or single or divorced or remarried or whatever, I don't care if you're an only child or from a family of 8, he dealt with all of these same struggles. And not only that, he had a God who chose him and called him and loved him and forgave him and, as we shall see, put Jacob to death and brought him to life over and over and over and over. In other words, he brought him into a period of being emptied of himself and then filled up with what God wanted him to be full of. So Jacob, as someone who was a struggling, sinful human being like all of us are, that intersects with our lives. And Jacob, who had a God who loved him despite everything, that also intersects with our lives. And so this ancient narrative from Genesis 25 through the end of the book, yeah, it's old and it's new. It's ancient and it's as contemporary as anything that's being written today. Because everything that we learn about Jacob is also a window into our own lives. And everything we learn about Jacob's God is also a window into God's work in our own life. So the life of Jacob fascinates me because it intersects with mine and with your life, and also because, let's be honest, not everybody in the Bible is interesting. There are people in the Bible that just don't have that kind of appeal. I'm not saying that in real life they weren't of a multifaceted kind of personality and character, but that's not always revealed to us in the Bible, right? Some people are much more interesting. Who's the most interesting disciple? Peter. We all agree? Maybe some of you disagree, but I think most people agree. Peter. Why? Because he's unpredictable, right? He's colorful. He's human. We can see Peter easily in our own lives. And I'm not saying the other guys weren't interesting, but the way that Peter is portrayed to us, we're like, yeah, I've been that guy. I am that guy, right? Now, when you get to the patriarchs, Abraham is fascinating. Isaac, I think, I don't want to insult anybody out there, but Isaac is kind of dull. As far as the patriarchs go, he just doesn't have that same draw. And maybe it's because we don't know as much about him. But Jacob, oh my goodness, we have more material about him than we do any of the patriarchs. In fact, we have more material about Jacob than perhaps almost any other biblical character. When do we meet him? Where's he at when we first meet Jacob? He's in the womb. He hasn't even been born yet. He's struggling with his brother, right? And we trace his entire life. We don't know, of course, what happened every year, but we know in these major parts of his life what happened to him. We're given insights into his dreams. We can feel what he feels. We know what happens on his wedding night. We know what happens when he discovers this bloody, torn robe that belonged to his favorite son, Joseph. And we're there all the way, not just to his death, but even to his burial. And along the way, if you're like me, when you read about Jacob, at times you're intrigued by him, at times you're disgusted by him, at times you laugh at him, at times you're perplexed about him. And in that way, he becomes the mirror of our own soul. And ultimately, that's why I like Jacob, because I see so much of me, the ugly parts of me, to be honest, in Jacob. So, studying his life, as we'll do today, is going to be also a time for reflection. It's a time for us to think about, how does this about Jacob reveal something about me that I need to confess? It's going to be a time for that. It's going to be a time when God is going to hold up before us a mirror in the life of Jacob where we can see the things that we often don't want to see. At the same time, studying the life of Jacob is going to hold before us a window. We look out that window and we see the God who never left Jacob's side, when it seems he should have. We'll see the God who never said, you know what? You are acting so selfish and so despicable that I'm going to look at somebody else. I'm going to be done with you. That's not what God did. And so we see that too. And that becomes, what an encouragement to us. Because when we see the ugly parts of us, we might think, how can God care about me? How can God love me? The same way he loved Jacob. The same way that he loved a lot of despicable characters in the Bible, and the same way he loves all of us still today. It's not as if God is going to look at us and say, there's a sinner, I can't love that person. His heart is drawn toward sinners. We are the very people that Christ came for. He didn't come for the holy. He didn't come for the righteous, whoever that might be. He came for sinners. His love drew him to people like Jacob, and his love still draws him to people like us. So Jacob's story ultimately becomes a window into who we are, and also a mirror into who we are, and also a window into the heart of God. So we're going to get into Genesis 25. If you have your Bibles or your phone apps or whatever you guys use these days, you can open up there. So we're going to kind of begin with this story, and we're not going to by any means be able to spend some time in all the various parts of it. We do want to start here at the beginning. And the beginning is, as I mentioned earlier, in utero. This is when his mom is pregnant and she's having these struggles. And of course, this is before you could go in, you could have a sonogram and figure out what's going on. So she inquires of the Lord what's going on. And the Lord tells her, this is Genesis 25:23, excuse me. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people shall be separated from your body, and 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Right away you learn that Jacob's story is never going to be just about Jacob. Just like Esau's story is never going to be just about Esau. Not 2 babies in your womb, but 2 nations, 2 peoples are in your womb. Already here we see that God has bigger plans for Jacob than just Jacob himself. Of course, he's going to be not just Jacob, but he's going to be Israel. He's going to be the one who, from his loins, from his own body comes forth the sons who become the patriarchs, and the patriarchs who become the heads of the tribes, and then the tribes who become the people of God. And it all starts here in the darkness of his mother's womb, with God making a promise about who he's going to be. Now, as Paul will talk about later in the book of Romans, this choice was made before either of these had done anything good or evil. It's not like God looked in the womb and he's like, man, I really like that one there. I like the way he's behaving in the womb, so I'm going to make him the chosen one. Had nothing whatsoever to do with that. God's choice and God's plan for Jacob originated before Jacob did anything good or evil. Now, the reason that's important is because it locates the initiative with God. It's not as if Jacob is going to have to grow up and be the kind of character who's going to attract God's attention. It's not as if Jacob has to be so moral and so upright that God is going to say, that's the guy that I pick. Which is great news for all of us, because that's still the way it works. It's not as if when God is looking out over the sea of humanity, he picks out a few people who are the best, the cream of the moral crop, and he's like, you, and you, I'm going to call to be my people, and the rest of you, sorry, but you're hopeless. That's not the way that God works. He doesn't look for the right kind of people to believe. He doesn't look for the right kind of people to call. He looks at sinners and he calls them all. Now, some believe and some don't. But it's not as if God's choice and God's calling is based upon our own character. It's not as if you have to work yourself up until you're finally head and shoulders above the rest morally, and then God says, that's the person that I want. And God illustrates this time and time again in the scriptures by calling people to do things that are not the choice any of us would make. Think about this. If you're on a mission board and there's a country or a city or wherever where you want to send somebody to preach the gospel, are you going to pick the guy that detests the people of that country, just hates them and wishes they would burn in hell forever? Is that the guy you're going to pick to send to the mission field? Yes. That's exactly who God sends to Nineveh, right? He sends Jonah, the very last person that any of us would pick. If you're going to pick a guy who's going to be the champion for your people, going to lead them out of bondage, going to be the guy that everybody looks up to, are you going to pick a guy who has some kind of speech impediment and he's 80 years old and he's on the run from the law for the last 40 years? No, you're not going to pick Moses, but God did. Over and over, God doesn't choose the choosable. He doesn't pick the pickable. He doesn't operate according to the way that we operate. The very last person we would pick is probably the first person that God would pick. And it's like that with Jacob. Already in the womb, God says, Jacob is going to be the one. The older is going to serve the younger. The younger is going to be the one who's going to carry on this patriarchal promise that began with Abraham and passed on to Isaac and now is going to go to Jacob. So already, I love this about the Jacob story. Already at the very beginning, we learn that God operates by grace and not by merit. He calls on the basis of his own heart and his own choosing, not on the basis of someone's worthiness to be called or worthiness to be chosen. Now, if you are well aware of your sinfulness, that's great news. But if you kind of are full of a little bit of self-righteousness, that's going to irritate you. Well, good. If you're irritated, that's exactly what you need to hear. Because we easily kind of get duped into the idea that, especially when we look around with our comparative righteousness scales and like, well, I'm a lot better than this guy. We can easily get duped into this idea of thinking that God likes us or loves us better than somebody else because of our moral character. No, it doesn't work that way. Your moral character doesn't affect the love of God for you whatsoever. The love of God is what it is, despite who we are, despite what we do. Okay, so let's keep moving with the story. She's comes full term. She has the twins, and we have the birth of the brothers that I call Harry and Heel. Harry, because it's a pun off of the Hebrew word for hairy. That's where you get Esau. And then, of course, Jacob is born, doing what? He's grasping his brother's heel, which in Hebrew is Akev, and thus his name is Yaakov. Now, right away, we learn something about Jacob. Even though I'm not saying that this baby was consciously doing this, but this little incident at his birth it's part of his biography. It's part of his personality. He's trying to hold on to his brother and kind of pull him back so that Jacob could be first. And the entire first half of his life is defined by trying to get around what he considers to be an accident of birth depriving him of. Jacob wants to be what? First, number one. Jacob wants to be number one. And for that reason, I like to refer to Jacob as the very first American. He's the first American who's ever born, way back in Genesis chapter 25. Because we're all about being first, right? You got to get ahead of everybody else. We got to be number one. Number two is not going to work. Number three is definitely not going to work. You got to be first. And to do that, you got to have this ambition that drives you to be first, that puts you ahead of everybody else. And you got to do whatever you got to do to get there. You got to make sacrifices. You got to sacrifice, some elements of your moral character. Okay, the end justifies the means. You got to put, kind of set your family aside, or your wife aside, or your kids aside to be able to accomplish your goals. Well, you just got to do what you got to do. Because what ultimately matters is being on top. What ultimately matters is being first. And you might got to kind of make sacrifices along the way to get there. That's Jacob. And unfortunately, that was me for the first 35, 40 years of my life. One of the reasons that Jacob's life speaks so strongly to me is because that's exactly who I was. A man of ambition, especially when I was younger. I knew what I wanted, and I was going to do anything to get it. Now, it just so happened that my career path was the ministry, but when I was at seminary, I got interested in the academic world, and so I was going to do anything necessary in order to achieve my goal, and the goal I was striving toward was to be a professor at the seminary. And so I arranged my entire life to make sure that that goal was accomplished. Now, for some of you, that might be you wanted to be the head of a company, you wanted to own your own business, you wanted to be a CEO, whatever it is. We know the way this goes. We're all guys, and we tend to self-identify on the basis of our accomplishments. And so we're driven to accomplish. And I'm not saying that's all bad. There'd be some good in that, but don't convince yourself that it's all good. It's not, because often our motives, not often, always our motives are mixed. And many of the mixture in those motives is entirely driven by selfishness, selfish ambition, pride, arrogance. That was me. And so I worked and I worked and I worked, and I made whatever sacrifices were necessary, many unrighteous sacrifices, in order to accomplish my goal. And guess what? I did. Pat myself on the back. I was very proud of my accomplishments. I got where I wanted to be. And what happened when I got where I wanted to be is that, well, of course, what else was going to happen? Pride, like a cancer, began to eat me away on the inside. And in the end, I ended up destroying every single thing that I'd worked so hard to achieve. Ended up being a man full of shame and self-loathing and failure, because I'd lost it all and I'd ruined it all because of my own sin. So I worked my way so far up to the top of the mountain only to fall off the cliff of pride and end up broken at the bottom of the cliff. Exactly where I needed to be. Exactly where I needed to be. I needed to be destroyed. I needed to be killed. I needed to be broken. Because that's the only way that God can begin to work on us. Because if we think that we have it all together, there's no room in there for God to work. So very often he will crack us a little bit, and sometimes he'll break us all apart in order to begin the process of putting us back together. So I know this drive to succeed. I know this ambition. I see it in Jacob. I saw it in myself, and I'm guessing that you see it either in your own life or at least in your past life, and maybe for some of you who are younger, you see it in your future life. There's nothing wrong with hard work. There's nothing wrong with striving to succeed, but do it. Do it for the other, not for yourself. If you want to be successful so you can be a better husband, a better father, great. Go for it. If you want to be successful so that you can pat yourself on the back and be proud of your accomplishments, be wary. Guarantee you, the fuel behind that is pride, and it leads to a downfall. Always does. So this is where Jacob is going. He's driven by this desire to get ahead of his brother. And so what's he going to do? Well, he's going to take the first step already in Genesis chapter 25 by doing what? Well, he's going to take advantage of his brother. So the story goes on that Esau comes in from hunting. Esau, by the way, is the guy with the gun rack in his pickup. Esau wears camouflage. You know, he's got some T-shirts, but most of his stuff is camo. He's got a gun rack. He probably would be buried home in Texas, where I live, maybe Michigan too. He's a man of the woods. He likes to hunt. He's a man's man. That's who Esau is. Jacob is a shepherd. It says he's living in tents, which is Hebrew it's a Hebrew description of people who are shepherding. So he's a shepherd. Esau's a hunter. Esau comes in from hunting. This is verse 29. Jacob had made some stew, and Esau comes in, and he's famished. And so Esau says to Jacob, now I'm reading this in English. I wish that we could read it in Hebrew, because when you read it in Hebrew, it sounds like Esau is kind of cavemanish. He can't even talk. He's like, give me red stuff. It's just like he can't even really speak well. That's the way that Esau is depicted here. And it's a helpful contrast, because when he says that, Jacob's ready. In fact, I suspect Jacob has been planning this for quite some time. Maybe this isn't the first time this has happened. And now Jacob realizes, I'm going to take advantage of this situation. He says his first recorded words right here. First, sell me your birthright. He's calculating. He knows what he wants. Now Esau responds, well, look, I'm about to die, so what use then is the birthright to me? Esau is also a bit of a drama queen. Esau is not about to die. He eats, he gets up, and he walks away. That's not what people do when they're so famished they're about dead, right? He's just hungry. And you know, when we're hangry, what do? We kind of exaggerate. It's like, God, if I don't eat in the next hour, I'm going to die. You're not but you're just giving vent to your hunger. That's Esau here. This first recorded biblical episode of being hangry here in Genesis 25. So he says this, Jacob says, "First swear to me." And he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. So Jacob gave Esau bread, lentil stew. He ate, drank, rose, went on his way, and thus despised his birthright. Esau despises his birthright, selling it for a bowl of soup. But don't read this as if Jacob gets off scot-free here. If Esau despises his birthright, then Jacob despises his brother. He takes advantage of the situation. He's calculating. He knows what he wants. He's going to take advantage of this situation in order to come a little bit closer to the achievement of his goal, supplanting his brother. Now, he hasn't done it yet, but that's what's going to happen as you keep reading the story. And we'll just spend a couple of minutes on this one just for the sake of time. But Genesis 27. You kind of skip a chapter. Genesis 26 we want to look at. But Genesis 27 is the great deception of his father. Now, I love this story. I love this story because it illustrates that in the midst of lying and backstabbing and deception and identity theft and this family division that's going on with jealousy and one parent liking one child better than the other parent likes the other child. In the midst of this whole family mess, it's nothing but ugliness. Over all of this, you have God using this to accomplish his own ends. Because what happens? Well, Jacob dresses up. His mom is, of course, kind of orchestrating the events, but Jacob goes to, she goes to Esau's closet and Jacob puts on Esau's clothes so he smells like his brother. And then mom cooks the goats so they taste like venison, which, by the way, I was told a few months ago by a guy who knows that actually goat does taste like venison. Anyone ever had both of these? Yeah? Would you agree? Okay, good. So further confirmation of this fact. So she makes the goat to taste like the venison, and of course, Jacob goes in, and he's covered in the hair, and he's got the food, and he smells like his brother. The only thing he can't change is his voice. Can't change his voice. And then in this episode, we have the next two recorded speeches of Jacob. One, he says to his mom, "But my brother is hairy and I'm smooth, and I'm going to appear as a deceiver if I'm caught." He's only worried about being caught. And then his next recorded speech is to his dad, in which his dad says, "Who are you?" And what does Jacob say? "I am Esau." And then he goes on to take the Lord's name in vain by saying, "The Lord provided the food with me. That's why I'm here so quickly." In the midst of this whole mess of family drama and family jealousy, God is working through all of this in unseen ways to accomplish his goal of Jacob receiving the blessing of the firstborn. This is the way it still works today. I've yet to meet a family where I see the jealousy and the betrayal and the rivalry and the hurt and the bloodshed and all the things that happen in families. I've yet to see a family where I can say, "Yep, you're beyond divine help." Such families don't exist. Because we have family after family in the Bible where, from a human perspective, we might look at them and say, "Oh, sorry, but you're beyond the pale of divine assistance." And God, time and time again, will step in and will use often horrible situations in the bigger perspective of salvation history to accomplish his goal. God can look at the worst mess and say, "Oh, yeah, I can bring some good out of that." He does it with Jacob's family. He does it with David's family, and he still does it with our families today. He can take, now, you don't believe, I know some of you don't believe me because you're thinking about your own marriage or your own family situation. You're like, no, this is not going to happen with us. Yes, it will. Yes, it can. Because we have a God who's bigger than your family situation. We have a God who's more gracious and merciful than you can possibly imagine. And we have a God who can take something which seems unredeemable and he can redeem it. He can bring good out of it. He did this with biblical family after biblical family, and he's going to do the same thing here. He's going to shift things so that the younger is placed above the older, as he often does in the scriptures. He's going to make sure that Jacob gets the blessing of the firstborn. Why? Again, because Jacob had such a great moral pedigree? No, the whole thing is deception from beginning to end. He's lying. He's taking the Lord's name in vain. He's not doing anything right, nor is his mom. And their poor dad is deceived. And yet in the end, God's will gets done. Because God's used to working with sinners. He's got a long, long history doing that. God's used to working with broken families. He's got a long, long history of doing that. And God is used to making sure that his mercy in the end triumphs and not our sin. He's used to making sure that his grace in the end is what wins the day and not our brokenness and not our iniquities, which is one more bit of good news for every single one of us. Whether it's your family or the family of your friend or maybe your extended family, whatever it is, God is behind the scenes always to, in some way, bring an ultimate good out of that situation. Because we have a God who has redeemed an entire broken world in the crucifixion and resurrection of his Son. And if he's done that for the entire world, do you think he's not going to be able to help your family? Of course he is. Because his movement toward us is defined by the movement of mercy. That's who he is. He shows his glory in giving to us, not withholding from us. He shows his mercy in forgiving us, not in condemning us. Ultimately, he shows every inclination of his will toward us is displayed in the cross of Jesus Christ. So if you want to know what God thinks about you, there you go. Look at the cross of Jesus Christ. That's what God thinks of you. Willing to give up everything in order to redeem your seemingly unredeemable life. He did it for Jacob. He did it for people throughout the scriptures, and he does the same thing for us still today. So we've just kind of dipped our toe into the Jacob stream. There's a whole lot more to come. But here we see a man driven by ambition, always wanting to get ahead. And God is going to teach him a few things along the way. But right away, we're introduced to the one that God is showing this grace and love to. And as we'll see in our next time together, we're also going to see that God shows up in his life in order to deliver a astonishing message. And that's going to be where we pick up when we come back in a few more minutes.